Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. Happy New Year to you, Shaka.
Happy New Year to you too, Paul.
And Happy New Year to you all our Facebook followers watching us live every Tuesday. Shaka Extra Time is a place where you get to talk to Shaka and ask him some questions. We'll maybe start by taking a closer look at some of the major stories that happened in Africa. But right away, let's maybe start in West Africa. Let's go to Liberia, Shaka. They had a remarkable election. Now President-elect George Weah had been trying for some time, and he finally got it. And I think people are happy with the results in West Africa.
An incredible story, Paul, but I think you are exaggerating a bit, really, because let's face it, the last time I checked, he only tried to be president in 2005. You remember he won the first round and lost the second round, and that is how Ellen Johnson Sirleaf became president of Liberia. The second time that you say he tried, he was a candidate. He was a running mate. He was not the head of the ticket. So this is the second shot, really, that he has looked for it and got it. And this is an incredible story, because you're talking about a kid from the slums, really. Somebody that comes from some of the most humblest beginnings. A man who moved on to become a world soccer star, top of the world, really. He won everything that you can think of. I don't think there is any other African, by the way, that has actually yet joined his class in terms of winning the big enchilada of FIFA World Cup. This is a man that is so respectable. A man that even used to personally sponsor the Liberian team, you know, playing in the African Cup and all that kind of stuff with his own money. It is an incredible story, and I wish him the best of luck.
In fact, some people have compared him to the Colombian drug warlord Pablo Escobar, because Pablo Escobar used to do a lot of things for his people, and he ended up actually bankrolling like the national soccer team. He came up with his own soccer team that would play against the national team, and so all sorts of he built churches, and people say that about George Weah, that he has built schools, built churches, supported a lot of people.
He's an incredible man. I recall that one time he came here to the Voice of America many, many years ago, perhaps before you actually checked in this building. And I remember the guy who introduced me to him was Sonny Young himself. This was George Weah. And the man was incredibly humble. You can't believe it, man. This man has humility. You could not believe that this guy was one of the richest guys, probably, you know, in Liberia, and very, very well off in Africa. Obviously, one of the most respected in his field. A man who had been like a high school dropout, and eventually, in fact, even went on to do very successful business, and also, by the way, he actually has a television station in Monrovia. And this is a man, let's face it, he went back to school, got not only one, but 2 university degrees to boot. You're talking about a bachelor's in business and also a master's degree in public administration. And people used to say, look, this man is not fit to be president. He is not educated. The last time I checked, my friend, there are so many people who have never been to anywhere, and they have been presidents of their own countries. I'm talking about a man like Jacobo Zuma, for example. He is credited for not having had what you would consider to be a formal Western education. And yet, a man who, let's face it, remarkably articulate. And he plays in the political major leagues of the world.
So what awaits George Weah? Obviously, the country is still in a recovery mode. They've had a very peaceful, maybe last 10 years. But there are a lot of challenges. We saw 2 years ago when Ebola struck, they were hit really hard, and they've not recovered from that. So he still has a lot of challenges politically, economically, and socially. What do you make of that? How can he overcome that?
He definitely does, and he would need more than players, really. First of all, there are so many expectations that are reflected, for example, in the people who voted for him. You're talking about a man who is very popular among the changing demographics, the very young people, and the majority of whom, frankly, are not invested in the economy. They are jobless, they need jobs, and he's talking about creating jobs. He's also, of course, talking about fighting corruption. How is he going to do this? The beautiful thing is that he actually, when he was making, a victory speech, he actually reached out to incumbent president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. He said that he really will be looking up to her and hope that she can use her uniquely remarkable international connections so that she can actually help bring foreign investment in Liberia, because you need a lot of foreign investment, you need aid in Liberia in order to be able to, for the new president, to be able to at least deliver on some of his promises. He will definitely, like I said, need more than prayers. He obviously has to put together a winning team, some of the best. And he seems to have a very inclusive policy. He's appealing to the Liberians, for example, in the diaspora, to go back home and help him and the others to actually rebuild their country.
You talked about something that I want to go back to. You talked about foreign aid to Liberia. Liberia is one of the single largest recipients of foreign aid, especially under the president, under President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. They were arguably receiving aid from almost every corner of the world. But did that aid translate into tangible things on the ground?
The problem, of course, is that it raises the issue of accountability or lack of it. That is one area where incumbent President Sirleaf has actually faced a lot of criticism. As a matter of fact, even some of his members of her family are reported, in fact, to have been engaged in some aspects of corruption. But let's face it, corruption is not limited to Liberia. It did not begin and is not going to end in Liberia. Corruption is all over the place. It seems to be, especially with Liberia and those countries really coming out of years of conflict and war and what have you, it seems to be part of a culture. And so, in terms of fighting that type of scourge, corruption, you're talking about looking at it really not as an event or an incident, but rather as fighting a process. And so you're going to have to, yes, identify it, but you have to balance a bit of other things, because you have to, for example, create jobs. You have to make these young people who have very high hopes in George Weah at least get a break. He has to come up with some very, I think, practical educational type of policies that have the potential of providing some skill sets to these young people so that they can get an opportunity and not only feed themselves, but also to help rebuild their country.
How about people who said that maybe perhaps choosing the former vice president, or rather the former president's wife to be his running mate was the wrong choice, and maybe that could actually split the country, considering what President Charles Taylor did to Liberians?
You know, to be very honest with you, I think that when you ask a question like that, you should also expect that the first people, frankly, that have probably the legitimate right to answer it are the Liberian people. And let's face it, the last time I checked, the Liberian people don't seem to really bother about that question at all. As a matter of fact, let's face it, you're talking about a lady who is a former wife, really. Is not currently married to Charles Taylor. They separated or divorced or whatever it is. She is a Liberian. She's by all accounts one of the best senators in the Liberian Senate. an accomplished politician in her own right, very well respected among her own peers and people. And as you look at the election results, let's face it, she actually delivered her county to the president-elect, George Weah. And let's face it, George Weah won in all the counties, with exception, guess what, of one. And even the vice president, let's face it, he did not even have anything to really criticize about. As a matter of fact, he considered defeat with grace, which is a very, very good thing for not only Liberia, but I think for African democracy.
So let's switch maybe to comments, but let me start with, there's been so much happening on the continent. You have all these strong men who are still wielding power. They don't want to leave. For example, you have Congo, DRC, President Kabila is staying put. You have Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, who just extended his mandate as a lifetime president. You have the likes of Kagame, Nkurunziza in Burundi, and so on and so on. But something interesting has been happening. These strong men are beginning to fight the church, especially the Catholic Church. What is the significance of these leaders? For example, Joseph Kabila in DRC, Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, Pombe Magufuli in Tanzania. They are all fighting the Catholic Church. What seems to be the problem?
It's very interesting, Paul, because you just reminded me, as a matter of fact, of an observation, really, by former French President Jacques Chirac. He had an advice then for a Zimbabwean president known as Robert Gabriel Mugabe. Of course, as we talk, you know that he has the distinction of being former Zimbabwean president, something apparently he never actually thought that it could happen. He thought that he could just end up perhaps being the late Zimbabwean president, so that historians can do their part. But Jacques Chirac once warned him and said, President Mugabe, in order for you to succeed in your position as president of your country, there are two institutions you have to make sure that you do not alienate. The first one was, he said, the Catholic Church. The second one, the media. Now, when you talk about the Catholic Church, you know as well as I do, because you come from a family of Catholics, parents, in fact, who one of them could have been in contention for the Pope. We're talking about an institution that is one of the most respected, an institution that is one of the most disciplined, most coherent, most well-organized, an institution that is very rich, very powerful. And guess what? The man who heads that institution sits in the Vatican. I say the man because we have never, in fact, had a female pope. And one wonders whether, in fact, there will be any female pope, at least in our lifetime. This institution, if you remember, first of all, is so powerful that almost everybody who is who can't wait to get a photo opportunity in the Vatican with the Pope. And this doesn't matter whether you come from a Jewish background, whether you come from a Muslim background, you come from Christianity, Protestant, Coptic, you name it. Everybody can't wait to breathe the same air with this Pope. And guess what? That smallest state in the world, the world among nations, the Vatican, if you remember, is the probably only last symbol of what was once the mighty, great Roman Empire. And so you can imagine when the bishops or the cardinals speak, let's face it, a lot of these politicians, people who want to transform themselves into presidential monarchs and what have you, they get concerned because these guys have a lot of support, a lot of following.
Of course, when it comes to Congo, the Catholic Church is a very, very big institution. And I think President Kabila is taking notice from that because over the weekend, they sent, over the Christmas holidays and New Year holidays, they sent troops to actually beat up people in churches, which was unprecedented.
That is very true. But actually, it's not as powerful as I originally thought it was, because in fact, it probably is supported by about 40% of the population. That's not a particularly small number, but I would have thought, obviously having been colonized by first, of course, King Leopold II, the King of Belgium, and then Belgium, I would have thought it would probably be in the neighborhood of about 80% Catholics. But again, thanks, of course, to the former Zairian President Mobutu Sese Seko, who essentially became very African and introduced or at least supported the indigenous Kimbuguism. You remember at one time he burnt all the Western names. You know, he used to be Joseph Desire Mobutu, and he ended up, of course, being Mobutu Sese Seko Wazabanga.
Let's cross at your home country, Uganda. Let's start with a comment from Prince Nkola Herbert Wailagira Jr. In Uganda. He wants to know, what do you anticipate another long-time ruler losing elections or losing power in 2018?
Well, anything is possible because, let's face it, you saw a man called Yaya Jammeh. He lost the election beginning with the year that we just came out. You have had some situations where other rulers have, you know, lost power, not necessarily through the electoral process, but through other means. And I'm talking about a man that was very widely called Uncle Bob, former Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe. He was removed by essentially a combination really of the army and you could say some kind of civil society, but it looked like this was frankly something that had been very, very well organized over a long period of time, so that they were expecting this man perhaps to give him respect as a founding leader of the independent Zimbabwe, probably really to die in office. But it reached a point where it looked like his second wife, Dr. Grace Mugabe, was actually being either groomed or at least being positioned to begin a Mugabe dynasty. And people like General Constantino Chiwenga, they felt differently. Now he's, of course, vice president, and at 61 years young, he obviously is not only in a position perhaps to be the next president, he could probably be a president anytime he wishes, because let's face it, he is also, by the way, the Minister of Defense.
Let's stay in Uganda. Let's go to Councillor Nsereko Latif. Where do you see Uganda years to come since the president just signed into law the age limit to extend his tenure in office?
Uganda is very interesting. As a matter of fact, I was reading some of the Ugandan papers, and the Ugandan president, Yoweri Museveni, was thanking the more than 300 members of parliament who delivered his gift for becoming, or at least getting an opportunity to be a life president. And guess what? He was actually saying that all those liars who have been talking about a Museveni life presidency have been exposed for who they are. He said that they are evil schemers who do not think that Uganda and Africa should succeed. Can you imagine? Doesn't this mean, therefore, Paul, that in fact he basically confirms what our suspicion has all along been, that he is like, you know, l'état c'est moi. I am the state, and the state is me. So in this particular case, actually, he's saying, I am Uganda, and even Africa. And Africa or Uganda is Yoweri Museveni. But I don't think it's going to last. Either he will probably leave power via divine intervention, or he could also leave power probably the same way one of his very, very role models, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, left power. This is a man who thought he was a revolutionary. And revolutionaries do not simply lose power or leave power, either through a piece of paper, like a ballot paper, or through other means. They die in office. The first one that used to say that was the brother leader from Tripoli.
Who was killed by
Who was killed, and of course his body, you know, ended up in a butchery. A butchery where you buy lamb or sheep meat, and you know those, the Arabs, they like a lot of sheep. Now, Mugabe was the second one. He's now former president. He has actually been treated very well, frankly, because let's face it, the crocodile, he was like a mentee. He was a protege of the old man. And he has really, really continued to respect him to the extent that they even gave him diplomatic status so that nobody touches him and he can go wherever he wants to go, more or less in the same way he used to go. Then now you have Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, who probably thinks that both Robert Mugabe and the late brother leader, Muammar Gaddafi, were probably stupid. They are probably stupid. They don't know how to deal with their armies, or they don't know how to deal with their societies and the international community. And let's face it, this man is only happy to be what he is because he has actually succeeded in becoming what some critics say is a good nyampara, which is the Swahili word of the supervisor of the Ugandan natives, in the process of making sure that he cannot contradict or oppose, but basically support the interests of foreign powers at the expense of his own people.
Let's go to two comments. One from Jafara wa Jafara. All despots eventually vacate power disgracefully. It's just a matter of time. And the president in Uganda should take notice. Then there's another comment here that says, is there from Adezi Ehime, is there a possibility that Cameroon and Uganda would experience the kind of political upheaval in Zimbabwe?
Anything is possible. You could get the Zimbabwean scenario, or you could borrow, for example, from Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. Blaise Compaoré, handsome Blaise. You know what happened? You know, and it is not only limited to those two individuals, by the way. What about the dean himself? I am talking about Theodore Obiang Mbagoso, the man in Marabo, the president of Equatorial Guinea. He's been actually this longest serving person or individual in that office globally. He came to power back in 1979, Paul. 1979, how old were you?
I was just 2 years old.
Can you imagine? This man calls himself president. Each term is 7. And his particular democracy, and he calls it democracy, he gets in the neighborhood of 97% or 98% of the vote, and ends up with like only one member of parliament sitting in the opposition.
One member of parliament?
Yes, and guess what? He seized the power from a man who happened to be his uncle, whom he characterized as a dictator. And he had him, in fact, hanged. He put him, in fact, rather, on a firing squad. The last time I checked, my brother, there has never been anything like a semblance, really, of even what you would call pseudo-democracy.
Let's go to another Facebook comment from Okele Weddle. does Africa need young leaders in the 21st century, or it's just okay, we have these old leaders, we just stay put?
It definitely needs young leaders. There's no question about it. Africa needs new blood. In fact, look at Western Europe, or look even at Canada and a lot of these first world countries. For the most part, their leaders are relatively young, because you need people who can think, on their feet, think very fast, who are very modern, who are very ICT savvy, like you, Paul, or not like me, a guy like me. I can talk like an encyclopedia, but when it comes to modern technology, I am very, very heavily challenged. So I think Africa needs that type of people, the people that can think, that can be innovative, can be imaginative, can be creative, in order to create jobs, my friend, in order to, to jumpstart the economies, in order to create wealth. So that people can live, live happily and ever. Let's face it. Look at a country like Singapore. People used to talk about the founding Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew, a man who founded Singapore as a poor third world country, and actually ruled it for 31 years. But it was a parliamentary system, and they really organized the elections that were democratic, really. His party always won, and he was always being appointed the prime minister. The last time I checked, their income per capita, you're talking in the neighborhood of $50,000 a person a year. So that is something. And when you go around the world, I'm sure you have seen some of these huge, giant Singapore Airlines, Boeing, and all that kind of stuff. And it's one of the best, in fact, airlines in the world.
Final comment, Richard Banada in Tanzania wants to know what steps can be taken to overcome the problems and challenges in the DRC.
Well, first of all, let's face it, at the end of the day, the international community can say whatever it wants to say, but I think, let's face it, it is in the end up to the citizens, the people of the Democratic Republic of Congo to make sure that democracy in their country is not only reflected in the name, but that rather in the deeds of the people who govern them. Or they should have people who govern them rather than rule them. So I think that, at one point, people are going to have to mobilize, organize, and eventually, let's face it, the law of the average is now, I think, in the favor of a better DRC.
What are you talking about tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa?
Actually, we're going to be talking about more of the same. We're going to be looking at the trajectory of African democracy.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Shaka, once again for your great insight.
You're most welcome.